You won't last 3 days living with me, my boss said, arms crossed, daring me to argue. That was 14 months ago. I never left. And 6 weeks after I moved my last box out of my flooded apartment and into her guest room, I was standing in a boardroom, under oath, in front of the company's entire executive board, defending both her career and mine, in the same breath. I need to explain who Elena Cross actually was before any of this makes sense, because my boss barely covers it. Elena ran operations at a logistics firm I'd worked at for 3 years. Sharp, exacting, famous throughout the company for a reputation that landed somewhere between brilliant and terrifying, depending on who you asked. She'd built her career from nothing, clawing her way up through an industry that hadn't made it easy for a woman to run a division that size, and the armor she'd built along the way didn't come off easily. For anyone, including the people who worked directly under her. I respected her enormously, and for most of the 3 years I'd worked under her, was also mildly afraid of her. In that specific way you're afraid of someone whose approval actually means something. She didn't do compliments. She did precise, surgical feedback, delivered without cruelty, but also without any cushioning. And you learned quickly, if she told you something was good, it actually was, because she wasn't in the habit of saying things she didn't mean. I remember the first time she actually praised something I'd done. About a year into working for her, a logistics restructuring proposal I'd spent weeks on, certain it would come back covered in red pen the way most of my early work did. She read it in silence, handed it back, and said only, "This is good. Implement it." Then she walked away before I could even respond. I told a coworker about it afterward, practically giddy, and he just laughed and said, "Congratulations. You've officially received the Elena Cross seal of approval. Frame it. It doesn't happen twice." Outside of work, she was almost entirely unknown to the rest of us. No one at the company had ever been to her house. No one really knew if she was seeing anyone, had family nearby, or did anything at all outside of the office beyond, as far as anyone could tell. More work. She lived, as far as the office rumor mill understood it, in a large house on the edge of town that she'd bought years earlier, and apparently rattled around in, alone. The night everything changed started with a burst pipe, 3 floors above my apartment, at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday. By the time I got home from a late shift, my entire unit was underwater. Ceiling collapsed in the bedroom, most of my furniture ruined, the building red-tagged by an inspector within the hour, and declared unsafe to occupy for at least 3 weeks while repairs were made. I stood in the parking lot at midnight, soaked, exhausted, holding a garbage bag of the few things I'd managed to salvage, with genuinely nowhere immediate to go. I ended up crashing at the office the next morning before my shift even technically started, catching a few hours of broken sleep on a break room couch, which is exactly where Elena found me when she came in early, as she always did. I remember waking to the specific sound of her heels on the tile, sharp and unmistakable even half asleep, and scrambling upright fast enough to knock a stack of old magazines off the side table, which did nothing to help the impression I was making at 6:15 in the morning. "Why are you sleeping in the break room?" she said. Not really a question, more an accusation. I explained the situation, the pipe, the flood, the 3 weeks of displacement, the fact that I hadn't slept properly in over 24 hours and hadn't yet figured out a real plan beyond survive today. She listened without interrupting, arms crossed, her expression unreadable in the way that had made grown men in strategy meetings visibly nervous. She studied me for a long moment, the specific, assessing look she gave underperforming quarterly reports, and then said something that genuinely stunned me. "I have a guest room. Empty. Has been for years. You can use it while your building gets fixed." I assumed, immediately, that this was some kind of joke, or a test I didn't understand the rules of yet. "That's really generous, but I couldn't." "It's not generosity," she said, cutting me off. "It's practical. You're useless to this division running on no sleep in a break room for 3 weeks. I have space. Use it." I hesitated, and something about my hesitation seemed to genuinely irritate her. "You won't last 3 days, she said, an edge of challenge entering her voice now, like my hesitation had insulted her somehow. "You'll find it too structured, too much, and you'll be back sleeping in your car by Thursday, out of pure stubborn pride. I've seen it before, with people who think they can handle more than they actually can." I don't fully know what made me say yes right then, except that something about being told, flatly, that I wouldn't be able to handle it, lit a specific, stubborn part of my brain I hadn't fully examined before that moment. "I'll take the room," I said, "and I'll prove you wrong." "We'll see," she said, already walking away, like the conversation had cost her nothing at all. Elena's house was exactly what the office rumor mill had built it up to be, and somehow also nothing like it. Large, immaculate, and almost unnervingly quiet. The kind of house that felt more like a well-organized hotel than a home someone actually lived in. Everything had its place. The kitchen counters were bare except for a single coffee machine. Not a single photograph hung on any wall I could see from the entryway, which struck me as strange for a house someone had apparently lived in for years. The rules, delivered within the first 10 minutes of arrival, were exact and non-negotiable. Kitchen closed after 9. Shared spaces kept spotless, no noise after 10, and absolutely no questions about anything on the second floor, which she made clear, without elaborating, was entirely off-limits. The first 3 days were, honestly, exactly as difficult as she'd predicted. I felt like a guest performing careful, constant politeness in a museum, terrified of breaking some unspoken rule I hadn't been told about yet. I tiptoed around the kitchen, second-guessed every small decision. Was it too loud to run the dishwasher after 8? Was it presumptuous to help myself to coffee without asking first? And generally existed in a state of low-grade anxiety I hadn't anticipated when I'd accepted her offer. We ate dinner separately most nights, crossed paths in careful minimal exchanges, both of us maintaining an almost exaggerated professional distance despite sharing a kitchen. On the third night, unable to sleep, I came downstairs around midnight for water and found Elena sitting alone at the kitchen table in the dark. A single lamp on, staring at nothing in particular. A glass of wine, mostly untouched, in front of her. "You're up late," I said, immediately regretting breaking the after 10 silence rule. "Can't sleep," she said, not looking up. "Happens some nights." I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to retreat or stay. "Do you want company, or do you want me to go back upstairs?" She looked at me for a long moment, something shifting slightly in her expression, some careful calculation happening behind her eyes. "You can stay," she said, "if you want." I sat down across from her, and for the first time in 3 days, the careful, formal distance between us cracked just slightly. Not dramatically, nothing that would have looked like anything to an outside observer, just two people sitting quietly at a kitchen table in the middle of the night, the silence between us less tense than it had been at any point since I'd arrived. My 3 weeks of displacement stretched, eventually, into something longer, because by the time my apartment's repairs were finished, neither of us had brought up the idea of me actually moving out, and I found I wasn't in any hurry to raise it either. The rigid formality of that first week softened gradually into something genuinely comfortable. I learned Elena cooked, actually quite well, when she let herself relax into it instead of treating dinner as another item to efficiently manage. She learned I could fix things around the house, a habit from years of a tight budget and a father who'd taught me basic repair work, and started leaving small notes about squeaky doors or flickering lights, an oddly domestic habit that felt entirely at odds with the woman I knew from the office. About a month in, I finally asked her about the second floor, carefully, aware I might be crossing a line she'd drawn clearly on my first night there. She was quiet for a long moment before answering. "It was my sister's space," she said. "She lived with me for a few years, before she passed. Car accident, 6 years ago. I haven't touched anything up there since. I know that probably sounds strange." "It doesn't sound strange," I said. "It sounds like grief that hasn't finished yet." She looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Something raw, unguarded, entirely unlike the careful, managed version of herself she brought to the office every day. "Most people don't understand that distinction," she said. "They think grief has a timeline, that 6 years should be long enough to have moved past it properly. I've stopped explaining it to people who ask." "I'm not asking you to explain it," I said. "I'm just telling you I understand it doesn't work that way." She told me more about her sister over the following weeks, in small pieces. The way people share the most important losses of their lives. A detail here, a memory there, never all at once. Her sister Kara had been the opposite of Elena in almost every way. Warm where Elena was guarded, spontaneous where Elena was careful, and Elena described their relationship as the one place in her life where she'd never had to perform competence, where she could simply exist as someone's sister instead of someone's boss. "I bought this house because it had enough room for both of us," Elena told me one evening, months into my stay, both of us on the back porch after dinner. I thought we'd grow old as the two eccentric spinster sisters, honestly. Half joking about it, the way you do when you're 28 and think you have all the time in the world to figure out the rest. Then I didn't have the time I thought I had, and I've spent 6 years in a house I built for 2 people, alone. unable to either sell it or actually live in the parts of it that remind me most of her. Something shifted between us that night, some quiet permission granted that hadn't existed before. The sense that I'd been allowed to see a version of her that almost no one else in her life had access to. Over the following weeks, that permission kept expanding. She told me about building the division from nothing, about the specific, exhausting cost of being taken seriously in an industry that hadn't wanted to take her seriously at all when she started. I told her about my own family, my own quieter struggles, things I hadn't fully articulated to anyone in years. The professional distance that had defined 3 years of working under her didn't disappear exactly, but it became something we both understood existed alongside something else entirely. Something neither of us had a clean name for yet, but that felt, increasingly, like it mattered more than the professional hierarchy that had brought us together in the first place. There was one evening, about 10 weeks into my stay, that I still think of as a real turning point, even though nothing dramatic happened in it. Elena had come home unusually late, clearly having had a difficult day, and instead of retreating to her usual composed distance, she sat down heavily at the kitchen table, and without much preamble, told me about a deal that had fallen through that afternoon after months of work, entirely due to a client's last-minute cold feet that had nothing to do with anything she'd done wrong. "I don't usually talk about work like this," she said, almost surprised at herself. "I don't usually talk about anything like this, if I'm honest." "You don't have to stop on my account," I said, setting a plate of leftovers in front of her, that I'd kept warm without really thinking about why. She looked at the plate, then at me, something soft crossing her face that I hadn't seen directed at me before. "Thank you," she said, and I understood, somehow, that she wasn't just thanking me for the food. That night marked, I think, the actual quiet beginning of whatever this eventually became. Not a dramatic declaration, just a boss letting an employee see her have a genuinely bad day, and finding, to her own apparent surprise, that being seen that way didn't cost her anything at all. I want to be honest about the fact that neither of us named what was actually happening for a long time, months longer than either of us probably should have let it go unnamed. We fell into a rhythm that looked, from the outside, almost domestic. Shared dinners most nights, easy conversation that stretched later and later, a comfort between us that had clearly moved past simple roommate courtesy into something neither of us was ready to examine too closely. I noticed myself looking forward to coming home in a way that had nothing to do with the house itself, and everything to do with who was in it. I noticed her laugh more, genuinely, at things I said, in a way I never once saw her do at the office. About 4 months in, at a company event neither of us had wanted to attend, a colleague asked, half joking, whether Elena and I were secretly living together, clearly intending it as a throwaway joke rather than a serious question. I watched Elena's expression flicker, just slightly, before she deflected smoothly, the way she deflected most uncomfortable questions, and I understood, watching that flicker, that the question had landed somewhere real for both of us, even if neither of us said anything about it that night. I remember the drive home from that event, both of us quiet in a way that felt loaded rather than comfortable, until Elena finally broke the silence somewhere near the highway exit for her neighborhood. "That question tonight," she said. "It shouldn't have bothered me as much as it did." "Why did it?" I asked. "Because I didn't have a good answer," she said. "And I don't like not having good answers. It's not really my area of expertise, not knowing things." I didn't push further that night, sensing she needed the conversation to end there for now, but the exchange sat with both of us, I think, in the weeks that followed. A small crack in the careful denial we'd both been maintaining about what our arrangement had actually become. It was Elena, eventually, who said something first. On an ordinary Tuesday almost 5 months after I'd moved in, both of us doing dishes together after dinner, an unremarkable domestic moment that somehow became the setting for the most important conversation we'd had. "I need to say something," she said, not looking up from the dish she was drying, "and I need you to let me get all the way through it before you respond, because if I stop partway through, I don't think I'll finish it." I put down the plate I was holding and waited. "I don't know how to do this the normal way," she said. "I've built my entire adult life around not needing anyone, around being the person other people depend on, instead of the reverse. And somewhere in the last 5 months, without my permission, that stopped being entirely true. I look forward to you being here in a way I haven't looked forward to anyone being anywhere in longer than I can comfortably admit. I don't know what to call that, or what I'm supposed to do about it, given everything complicated about our situation. I just know I'm tired of pretending I haven't noticed it. I didn't have a perfectly composed response ready, but I didn't need one. I've noticed it too, I said. I've noticed it for months, honestly. I just didn't know if it was my place to say something first. It's both our place, she said, finally looking up at me. That's kind of the entire point. 6 weeks after that conversation in the kitchen, everything we'd carefully, privately built collided with something neither of us had seen coming. Elena had, for over a year, been quietly navigating tension with a faction of the company's board who'd wanted her division restructured, her authority reduced, her role diminished in favor of a candidate more aligned with the board chairman's preferred direction for the company. It was corporate politics I'd been peripherally aware of but hadn't understood the full scope of, until the tension finally came to a head. Elena had mentioned Whitfield to me a handful of times over the preceding months, always briefly, always with the specific weariness of someone describing an ongoing, low-grade professional battle she'd mostly learned to manage rather than resolve. He'd been on the board for almost a decade, had backed a different candidate for her position when she'd originally been promoted, and had apparently never fully let go of the belief that she'd gotten the role through circumstances other than merit, a belief she'd spent years disproving through sheer results. Results that, infuriatingly, never seemed to fully satisfy him. The board chairman himself, a man named Whitfield who'd never fully hidden his dislike of Elena's leadership style, found out about our living arrangement. How, exactly, neither of us ever fully confirmed, though Elena suspected a colleague's offhand comment at that same company event had eventually made its way to the wrong ears. Whitfield used it, deliberately and strategically, framing the situation to the rest of the board as evidence of exactly the kind of unprofessional judgment that made Elena unfit to continue running a division of that size. A senior executive living with, and apparently romantically involved with, a subordinate roughly a decade her junior. An arrangement he characterized as reckless at best and predatory at worst, regardless of how untrue that characterization actually was. Elena was called before an emergency board session to answer for it directly. "I need you to understand what's actually happening," she told me the night before, more shaken than I'd ever seen her, sitting on the edge of the bed with her hands pressed flat against her knees. A physical stillness I recognized as her way of holding herself together. Whitfield doesn't actually care about ethics or propriety. He's wanted my seat on that board for 2 years, and he's found the first piece of ammunition credible enough to actually use. If this goes badly, I could lose the division I built from nothing, over something that has nothing to do with how I've actually run this company, and everything to do with boardroom politics dressed up as concern. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "I need you to understand that whatever happens in that room tomorrow, it's not fair, and it's not really about us. It's about a man who's been looking for a reason for 2 years, and we accidentally gave him one." She was quiet for a moment, staring at her hands. "I've spent 6 years building something I'm actually proud of. I've never once let anyone see how much it would cost me to lose it. I don't know how to let you see that either, honestly. Even now. You don't have to perform strength for me," I said. "Not tonight. I think that's kind of the whole point of everything that's happened between us this past year." She looked up at me, something raw crossing her face. "I'm terrified," she admitted, the word landing with the specific weight of something she rarely allowed herself to say out loud. "Not of losing the title, of losing the thing I built that actually meant something, over a technicality that has nothing to do with whether I've earned it." "Then let's go in there tomorrow and remind them exactly what you've earned," I said. "Both of us, together." The board hearing was, without question, the most intense professional experience of my life, and I wasn't even the one whose career was primarily on the line. The room itself felt engineered for intimidation. A long mahogany table, 11 board members seated along its length, Elena and I positioned at the far end, like defendants rather than employees. Whitfield sat near the head of the table, composed, clearly relishing the procedural formality of the moment, in a way that told me exactly how long he'd been waiting for an opportunity like this one. Whitfield laid out the situation with careful, deliberate framing. A senior VP housing, and by his characterization, romantically entangled with a subordinate employee, raising questions about judgment, favoritism, and appropriate professional boundaries. He'd clearly rehearsed the presentation, every word calculated to make the arrangement sound as damning as possible, without ever quite crossing into outright accusation he couldn't back up. He used phrases like concerning pattern and compromised objectivity, each one landing with the practiced precision of a man who'd spent a career learning exactly how to make an insinuation without technically making a claim he'd have to defend. I watched Elena throughout his presentation, sitting perfectly still, expression composed in the exact professional mask I recognized from 3 years of watching her handle difficult meetings, though I could see, in the tight set of her jaw, exactly how much that composure was costing her. I was called to speak, given the opportunity to address the board directly, and I understood, sitting in that chair, exactly how much weight my next few minutes were going to carry. I want to correct a few things, I said, because I think the framing here has left out most of what actually happened. My apartment flooded. I had nowhere to go on short notice. Elena offered a guest room out of practicality, not romance. And for the first several months, that's exactly what it was. A practical arrangement between a boss and an employee navigating an emergency. What developed after that developed slowly, honestly, and mutually, between two adults who were, and are, capable of making that decision for themselves, without it compromising either of our professional judgment. Can you speak to whether this relationship has affected any decisions regarding your role, compensation, or advancement within the division? One of the board members asked, a woman near the middle of the table whose expression, unlike Whitfield's, seemed genuinely curious rather than predetermined. No, I said. If anything, Elena has been harder on my performance reviews since this began than she was before, specifically to avoid any appearance of favoritism. I've received zero preferential treatment. I can provide documentation of every project assignment and review from the past year, if the board wants to verify that directly. Whitfield pressed further, trying to reframe the arrangement as evidence of poor judgment regardless of favoritism, arguing that the mere existence of the situation demonstrated a lapse serious enough to question Elena's broader decision-making. With all due respect, Mr. Whitfield, I said, feeling something harden in me, I think what's actually being questioned here isn't judgment. It's whether a woman who built this division from nothing is allowed to have a personal life that doesn't fit neatly into whatever image this board has decided is appropriate for someone in her position. I don't think that's a fair standard, and I don't think it's one this board would be applying nearly as aggressively if the genders here were reversed. The room went quiet after that. A specific, charged silence that told me I'd said something that had actually landed, for better or worse. I watched two board members exchange a brief glance, and I couldn't tell if it was agreement or discomfort. But either way, something in the room's temperature had shifted. Elena was given the chance to speak as well, and she did, with a controlled precision that reminded me, even in that moment, exactly why she'd built the career she had. I've run this division for 6 years, she said, revenue up 43% over that period. Employee retention the highest in the company. I've delivered results this board has never once questioned, until my personal life became inconvenient for someone with an agenda that predates this entire situation by years. I'd invite the board to review my actual record, rather than a narrative constructed by someone who's wanted my position since before I ever earned it. The board deliberated for almost 2 hours while Elena and I waited outside, neither of us saying much, both of us aware that whatever came out of that room was going to determine far more than just her job title. Those 2 hours felt endless, in the specific way waiting always does when the outcome is entirely out of your hands. Elena paced the hallway for the first 20 minutes, then sat, then paced again, checking her phone for no real reason beyond needing something to do. I mostly watched her, trying to think of something useful to say and failing to find anything that felt adequate to the moment. Whatever happens in there, I said, finally. You built something real. That doesn't stop being true, no matter what that room decides. I know, she said. I keep telling myself that. It helps less than I'd like it to. When they finally called us back in, the chairman who'd replaced Whitfield in leading the session, Whitfield himself had been asked to step outside during the final vote, given his clear personal stake in the outcome, delivered the board's decision with a formality that made the room feel even more tense than it already had. The board finds no evidence of professional misconduct, favoritism, or compromised judgment, she said. Ms. Cross's leadership of the operations division will continue without alteration. The board does, however, formally note concern regarding disclosure protocols for personal relationships involving direct reports, and requests that appropriate documentation be filed going forward, consistent with company policy. But it was enough. Elena kept her division, kept her seat at the table, and Whitfield, having overplayed a hand that ultimately revealed more about his own agenda than about any actual impropriety, found his influence on the board noticeably diminished in the months that followed. I watched Elena's shoulders drop, almost imperceptibly. The specific release of tension held too long to fully register, until the pressure actually lifted. She thanked the board with a composure that impressed me even in that moment, shook hands with several members on her way out, and didn't fully let herself exhale until we were alone in the elevator, Doors closed, the two of us finally out of view of anyone who might read something into her expression. "I thought I was going to lose it in there," she admitted, leaning back against the elevator wall. "Not the vote, my composure. I've spent 6 years making sure nobody in that boardroom ever saw me as anything other than completely in control, and today, I came closer than I've ever come to losing that." "You didn't lose it," I said. "You held it together, and you still told the truth. That's harder than either one alone." She was quiet for the rest of the elevator ride, and when the doors opened into the parking garage, she stopped walking for a moment, turned to me, and did something I hadn't fully expected. She pulled me into a tight, unguarded hug, right there in the middle of the garage, in full view of anyone who might have walked past. "I don't care who sees this anymore," she said, her voice slightly muffled against my shoulder. I spent that entire hearing terrified of exactly this, of what it would mean if people saw us, saw this, saw me needing someone the way I clearly need you. I'm done being terrified of it. I held on to that moment for a long time afterward, longer than the hug itself lasted. The specific image of Elena Cross, the most controlled, most private person I'd ever worked for, finally choosing to be seen, in a parking garage, in the immediate aftermath of the most stressful day of her professional life, simply because she'd decided she didn't want to hide anymore. Elena didn't say much on the drive home that night, the adrenaline of the hearing slowly draining into a kind of exhausted relief. It wasn't until we were back in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd first told me she couldn't pretend not to notice what was happening between us, that she finally spoke. "Thank you," she said, "for what you said in there. I don't think I could have said it as clearly myself, given how personally the whole thing was directed at me." "I meant every word," I said. "I've never seen you build something the way you built that division, and I wasn't going to sit there and let a man who's never had to fight for anything the way you have take it from you, over something that isn't actually about ethics at all." It's been 14 months since that first night I slept in the office break room, soaked and exhausted, and Elena found me there. I never did move back out. What started as a 3-week practical arrangement became, gradually and then all at once, the entire architecture of my life. We got engaged 3 months ago, and when I proposed, I made a point of reminding her of that first challenge. You won't last 3 days. Because I think it matters that the story includes exactly how reluctant and uncertain the beginning actually was. Elena likes to say now, with the same dry precision she's always had, that it's the only bet she's ever been genuinely happy to lose. The second floor of the house is different now, too. Not erased, never erased, but opened up slowly, over months, into something Elena could actually walk through without it swallowing her whole. We turned part of it into a small study, keeping a few things of her sister's carefully preserved elsewhere, a compromise that took a long time to arrive at but that Elena says feels right in a way she didn't expect it to. I remember the first afternoon we cleared out the room together, both of us moving slowly, deliberately, Elena narrating small memories attached to specific objects as we went. A concert ticket stub, a stack of unfinished letters, a sweater she couldn't quite bring herself to donate but also couldn't keep folded in a drawer forever. It took the better part of a full weekend, and by the end of it, she cried for the first time I'd ever actually witnessed. Not the composed, private grief she'd clearly managed alone for 6 years, but something released, something finally shared. Whitfield resigned from the board about 8 months after the hearing. The specific slow erosion of influence that follows a failed power play finally catching up with him. Elena doesn't spend much time thinking about him anymore, which she says is its own kind of victory, separate from the vote itself. She told me once that the real satisfaction wasn't watching him lose his seat. It was realizing, months later, that she'd stopped needing him to lose anything at all in order to feel secure in what she'd built. I think about that first night in the parking lot often, soaked, exhausted, holding a garbage bag of salvaged belongings, genuinely unsure what came next. I think about how easily that night could have gone differently, if Elena had simply pointed me toward a hotel instead of offering her guest room, if I'd been too proud or too intimidated to accept an offer that came wrapped in a dare I felt compelled to prove wrong. I think, too, about the version of the board hearing where Whitfield's framing actually succeeded, where the board, swayed by careful insinuation rather than actual evidence, decided the arrangement really was the liability he'd painted it as, and Elena lost the division she'd spent 6 years building, over something that had nothing to do with her competence. I don't know what either of our lives would look like now, in that version. I'm grateful, every day, that it's not the version that happened. Here's what I've come to believe. Sometimes the people who seem the most guarded, the most unreachable, the most unlikely to ever let anyone close, are guarding something specific and real, not just performing distance for its own sake. Elena didn't need a subordinate proving a point about resilience. She needed someone patient enough to sit with her in a quiet kitchen at midnight, someone willing to stay long enough to be trusted with a second floor she couldn't walk through alone. I didn't know that's what I was signing up for when I said, "I'll take the room." I'm endlessly grateful I said yes anyway. I think about the dare itself often too, how something delivered almost like a challenge, an edge of genuine skepticism in her voice, ended up being the mechanism that let her offer help without it looking, to either of us, like vulnerability. I understand now that Elena rarely, if ever, asked for anything directly. She dared, she challenged, she framed generosity as a test of someone else's grit, because doing it that way meant she never had to admit she wanted the company, wanted someone in that too quiet house with her, wanted, more than she'd let herself acknowledge even to herself, to not be alone in it anymore. I asked her once, months after everything had settled, whether she'd known, that first morning in the break room, that the offer was ever going to become anything more than what it appeared to be on the surface. "No," she said, without hesitation. "I want to be honest about that. I offered because it was practical, and because some part of me, watching you asleep on that ridiculous couch, recognized something in you I couldn't fully name yet. I didn't know it would become this. I don't think either of us could have known that. Not from a conversation that started with me telling you that you wouldn't last 3 days." "Are you glad you were wrong?" I asked. "I am almost never glad to be wrong," she said, the dry precision returning to her voice, though softened now by something warmer underneath it. "This is the one significant exception I'm willing to make. If there's one thing I'd tell anyone facing a challenge that feels like it's daring them to fail, it's this. Sometimes the dare isn't actually about proving you can last 3 days. Sometimes it's the only way someone who's spent years protecting themselves knows how to let someone in, without having to ask for it directly. I lasted 3 days. Then I lasted 3 weeks. Then I lasted forever, and I'd do every uncertain, uncomfortable day of it again, exactly the same way, if it led back to this. If this one got you, tell me in the comments. And if you want more real stories like this, subscribe. There's a new one waiting for you every week.